It was nearly midnight when the call came in. Agent Ryan Carter had just drifted into a half-conscious daze, the static of his police scanner filling the background, when his phone vibrated violently on the table. He squinted at the unknown number. It wasn't good news. He could feel it in his bones. "Carter," he answered, voice groggy. A pause on the other end. Then, a low voice spoke with an urgency that snapped Carter into full awareness. "Agent Carter, we have an emergency. Another disappearance. The Riddle House." The words sent a chill down his spine. Everyone in the paranormal division knew about the Riddle House, an ancient structure sitting abandoned on the edge of town. Its dark history spans centuries, filled with tales of people who went inside and never came out. Bodies were rarely recovered, and when they were mutilated beyond recognition, broken, twisted, as though something inhuman had toyed with them. "I thought that place was sealed off," Carter muttered. "Not anymore," the voice replied, solemn. "The team we sent last week, they're gone, vanished. We need you." 20 minutes later, Carter stood at the operations center, looking over grainy footage from inside the house. Flickering night vision images of an empty corridor, strewn with debris, played on loop. In the last frame, a black shape moved just out of view, something not human. The team was assembled. Carter was joined by Agent Miles, a tech whiz with a nervous laugh, and Agent Sloane, an expert on cryptids and supernatural creatures. They were briefed quickly, shown reports of the missing teams, and given the location of strange paranormal energy spikes detected around the Riddle House. The government wasn't just concerned, they were terrified. Something had crossed from the house into the surrounding town. The mission was clear: retrieve any survivors, if there were any, and contain the outbreak. It seemed simple, but Carter had dealt with too many simple cases that ended in blood. As they piled into their black van and headed toward the house, rain began to fall in thick sheets, turning the road into a blur. Thunder cracked violently overhead, almost as though the storm itself was trying to warn them away. "Carter, do you think any of them are still alive?" Sloane asked, her voice betraying a tremor of fear. Carter's jaw tightened. "We'll find out soon enough." The headlights cut through the fog as the van came to a stop at the gates of the Riddle House. The air was thick, almost suffocating. No one spoke as the enormous, decaying structure loomed in front of them, its windows like black, watching eyes. "We go in. No turning back now," Carter whispered. But something in the pit of his stomach told him that the house had been waiting for them all along. The heavy iron gate screeched as they pushed it open, the sound echoing through the night like a tortured soul. Carter led the way, his flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the fog. The others followed in tense silence, their breaths visible in the cool, damp air. The front door of the Riddle House stood ajar, swaying slightly in the wind, as if inviting them inside. Carter hesitated for just a second before stepping through, gun drawn and ghost hunting equipment ready. The air inside was colder, far colder than it should have been. The house was dead silent, yet every creak of the floorboards under their feet felt like the house was groaning, waking up from a deep sleep. Agent Miles, ever the techie, was already scanning with his electromagnetic field detector. "We're getting readings off the charts," he whispered, eyes wide. The blinking lights on his device danced erratically, confirming what they already knew. They weren't alone. They reached the grand staircase, where dust clung thick to every surface. But something was off. There were tracks, footprints, that led up the stairs and disappeared into the darkness above. Carter followed the trail with his flashlight, but the beam revealed nothing beyond a black void. "Stay close," Carter murmured, his voice barely audible. They began to ascend, every step seeming heavier, as though the air itself was pressing down on them. Halfway up, a distant noise echoed through the house, a low growl that made their skin crawl. Sloane froze, her hand gripping Carter's arm. "Did you hear that?" Before Carter could respond, a violent crash came from somewhere above them, followed by a blood-curdling scream. It was guttural and human, something not of this world. They bolted up the remaining steps, flashlights darting wildly in the darkness. But when they reached the landing, they were met with silence again. Just the oppressive, suffocating silence of the house. No sign of the source of the scream. No sign of life. Suddenly, Miles' equipment started shrieking with static. "There's something here, right here," he yelled. A cold gust of air blasted through them, knocking them back. In the beam of Carter's flashlight, a shadow moved, twisting, crawling, growing longer. It moved like no human should, scuttling across the ceiling. Carter's blood ran cold. What the hell is that? The thing dropped to the floor with a sickening thud, its form indistinct but undeniably wrong. And it was coming for them. "Run!" Carter yelled as the shadow lunged. The sound of their pounding footsteps echoed through the dark halls as they ran, the creature's guttural growls right behind them. Carter's heart slammed against his chest, each breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel it, something hot and foul like death itself, just out of sight, creeping closer. "Left! Go left!" Sloane shouted, yanking Carter by the arm as they barreled down a narrow corridor. The walls seemed to close in around them, the air growing colder with every step. Behind them, the creature let out a screech that made the hairs on the back of Carter's neck stand up. "Is it still following us?" Miles gasped, stumbling as his gear clanked noisily at his side. Carter didn't have to look back to know. "Keep moving," he barked. They burst through a door into what looked like an old basement. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Rusted chains hung from the ceiling, and shattered wooden crates were scattered across the floor. It felt like a tomb. Sloane slammed the door shut behind them, wedging a broken chair under the handle. "That won't hold it for long." Miles collapsed against the wall, frantically fiddling with his ghost hunting equipment. "This thing is off the charts. Whatever's down here, it's not just one spirit. There's something bigger." Before Carter could respond, the room plunged into darkness. The only light was the weak glow of Miles' device, flickering erratically. The temperature dropped even further, and an unnatural quiet settled over them, like the house itself was holding its breath. Sloane whispered, "What the hell is going on?" Suddenly, something moved in the shadows. Carter raised his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom, but what he saw made his blood freeze. Crawlers, distorted figures that twisted and skittered along the walls and ceiling, their limbs unnaturally elongated, their skin stretched tight over bony frames. Their hollow eyes stared at the team, mouths gaping in silent screams. "They're everywhere," Miles whimpered, backing into the corner. Carter didn't hesitate. "We need to move now." But as they took a step forward, the crawlers descended, moving with impossible speed. One grabbed Miles by the leg, its bony fingers sinking into his flesh. His scream was cut short as he was dragged across the floor, disappearing into the dark abyss beneath the basement. "Miles!" Sloane shouted, reaching for him, but Carter pulled her back. "There's nothing we can do," he hissed, eyes wide with horror. The crawlers circled them, inching closer, their twisted forms moving in jerks and spasms. Carter raised his gun, but deep down, he knew bullets wouldn't stop these things. They had to escape. "Go!" he shouted, grabbing Sloane and making a break for the stairs at the far end of the basement. But the door slammed shut ahead of them with a deafening crash, sealing them inside. The crawlers were closing in. There was no way out. The door wouldn't budge. Carter slammed his shoulder against it, desperate to break free, but it was as if the house itself was working against them. The crawlers clicked and hissed from the shadows, their emaciated bodies contorting as they crept closer. Carter's flashlight flickered wildly, the battery draining too fast. "We're trapped." Sloane's voice trembled as she backed into a corner, her eyes darting between the approaching crawlers and the sealed door. Carter could feel his mind spiraling into panic, but he pushed it down. "There has to be another way," he muttered. His hand fumbled at his belt, gripping a small silver knife, a last resort tool designed for paranormal encounters. He didn't know if it would work, but he wasn't going down without a fight. Then, as if in response to his defiance, the air in the room shifted. The temperature dropped to an unbearable level, and a deep, growling voice echoed from the shadows. "You should have stayed away." Suddenly, the crawlers halted, their grotesque forms shuddering as something even darker emerged from the depths of the basement. A figure loomed in the far corner, a skinwalker, its tall, skeletal body draped in the skins of animals and humans alike, its face a grotesque mask of shifting shapes. The air around it vibrated with malevolent energy. Sloane gasped, pressing her back against the wall. "Carter, that's—" "I know." He cut her off, eyes locked on the creature. "It's a skinwalker. Don't look it in the eyes." The skinwalker moved closer, its presence suffocating, as though the room itself was being consumed by its darkness. It didn't walk so much as glide, its twisted form never quite staying solid. The crawlers shrank back, making way for their master. "We can't fight this," Sloane whispered, fear overtaking her. "We don't have a choice," Carter said, holding up the silver knife. "Just stay behind me." But before he could make a move, the skinwalker let out an ear-piercing screech, the sound rattling through their bones. With unnatural speed, it lashed out, knocking Carter across the room with a single swipe of its arm. He crashed into the wall, his vision blurring as pain shot through his body. Sloane screamed, ducking as the skinwalker's clawed hand slashed through the air, narrowly missing her. She scrambled toward Carter, pulling him to his feet. "We have to get out of here." The basement began to shake, dust and debris raining from the ceiling as the house itself seemed to respond to the skinwalker's fury. The walls groaned, splintering and cracking. Carter groaned, pushing himself upright. "There's a hatch," he gasped, pointing to a corner of the floor. It was barely visible in the dim light, but it was there, their only way out. Sloane wasted no time. She bolted toward the hatch, pulling it open just as the skinwalker lunged at them. Carter shoved her inside before diving in after her, slamming the hatch shut as the skinwalker's claws scraped against the wood above them. They landed hard in the dirt below, gasping for breath. Above them, the skinwalker's enraged screeches filled the air. For now they had escaped, but the hunt wasn't over. The damp earth pressed against their faces as Carter and Sloane lay in the darkness, hearts pounding. The skinwalker's furious screeches echoed from above, vibrating through the ground, but it didn't follow. Not yet. Carter sat up, his body aching from the fall. Blood trickled down his arm from where the skinwalker's claws had raked him. Sloane knelt beside him, breathing hard, her face pale in the dim light of the tunnel they'd fallen into. "You're bleeding," she whispered, voice shaky. Carter glanced at the wound, deep gashes that burned with an unnatural heat. "It's nothing," he lied, but the truth was obvious. This wasn't a normal injury. The skinwalker's touch had tainted the wound, and it was spreading dark veins spidering from the claw marks. "I'll wrap it," Sloane muttered, pulling out a strip of gauze from her kit. As she bandaged his arm, the air around them grew colder. The walls of the tunnel seemed to pulse, like the house was breathing. Carter winced as the gauze pressed against his wound, a sharp pain radiating up his arm. "We need to keep moving." Sloane nodded, though her eyes kept flicking back to the wound, worry etched on her face. "Do you hear that?" she whispered suddenly. Carter froze, listening. At first, it was just silence, but then whispers. Faint, barely audible voices, like they were coming from deep within the walls themselves. The words were indecipherable, but the tone was unmistakable. Something was calling to them. Sloane's hand trembled as she turned on her flashlight, shining it down the narrow tunnel. The light flickered, casting long shadows on the dirt walls. The whispers grew louder, clearer, filling the tunnel with an oppressive weight. "It's them," Sloane breathed. "The missing teams. Their voices." Carter's jaw tightened. "No. Whatever this is, it's trying to lure us in." Suddenly, the whispers were interrupted by a distant sound, a low, guttural growl from the far end of the tunnel. The ground trembled beneath them, dirt falling from the ceiling. Something was coming. "Run!" Carter barked, grabbing Sloane's arm and pulling her down the tunnel. They stumbled through the darkness, the walls closing in around them, the growling growing louder, closer. As they ran, Carter's vision blurred. The pain from his wound intensified, the veins spreading further up his arm, turning his skin a sickly gray. His breath came in ragged gasps, and the whispers seemed to grow louder in his head, filling his mind with incoherent, maddening thoughts. They reached a fork in the tunnel, and Carter hesitated, unsure which way to go. But there was no time to think. The growling was right behind them now, something massive moving through the tunnel, clawing its way toward them. In a flash of panic, they bolted left, plunging deeper into the darkness. Behind them, the growls intensified, and then silence. Carter's heart hammered in his chest as he realized the creature had stopped following them. But the whispers didn't stop. They were here to stay. They emerged from the tunnel into a narrow stone passage, lit only by the faint glow of Sloane's flickering flashlight. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if the house itself was bearing down on them, refusing to let them go. Carter's wound throbbed painfully, but he pushed the agony aside. They couldn't stop now. Ahead of them, the passage opened into a small, crumbling room. At the center stood an old wooden table, and sitting around it were three figures, their faces barely visible in the dim light. Carter's blood ran cold. He recognized the faces, members of the criminal family tied to the Riddle House's twisted past. The Bexley family. Their involvement in the house's bloody history was a well-kept secret, but Carter had uncovered enough during his research to know they weren't mere victims. They were part of something far darker. "Welcome," a voice rasped from the shadows. One of the men, a gaunt figure with sunken eyes, stood slowly, his movements jerky, unnatural. "We've been expecting you." Sloane raised her gun, her hand trembling. "Stay back." The man let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Guns won't help you here, girl. The house, it has claimed us all. You think we're free? You think you can stop this?" Carter took a step forward, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. "What do you mean, claimed?" The man's lips twisted into a grin, his teeth yellow and jagged. "This house, these things, they aren't just spirits. They're ancient, older than time. The Skinwalkers, the crawlers. They're just the beginning. We," he gestured to the other two figures, their eyes vacant and lifeless, "are part of it now." Carter's grip tightened on the knife. "You're saying you let this happen? That you're responsible for all the deaths?" The man's grin faded, replaced by a look of cold resignation. "We didn't have a choice. The house, it demands blood. And those who try to leave," his voice trailed off as he glanced at the others. "Well, you've seen what happens." Before Carter could react, the door behind them slammed shut, the walls vibrating with a deep, unnatural hum. The air grew colder, and the faint whispers returned, louder now, echoing off the stone walls. Sloane's voice was barely a whisper. "Carter, we need to get out of here." But the Bexley man shook his head slowly, his sunken eyes locked on Carter's. "You won't leave. No one leaves the Riddle House." Suddenly, the two figures at the table lunged forward, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Carter and Sloane barely had time to react as the room erupted into chaos. The room erupted into chaos as the two figures lunged at Carter and Sloane, their movements disturbingly inhuman. The air was charged with a malevolent energy that pressed down on them, making it difficult to breathe. Carter swung his flashlight, trying to fend off the attackers, but the beam cut through them like mist. "Back!" Carter shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers that filled the room. He grabbed Sloane's arm, pulling her toward the door, but it was locked tight, the wood warped and splintered. One of the figures, a gaunt woman with hollow eyes and a twisted mouth, slashed at Carter with long, claw-like nails. He barely managed to dodge, feeling the rush of air as her claws missed him by inches. He retaliated, swinging his flashlight with all his strength. The woman staggered back, but didn't go down. Sloane was on the floor, struggling with the second figure, a skeletal man whose eyes glowed with a sickly green light. She managed to scramble to her feet, but her flashlight was knocked from her hand, the light extinguished in the darkness. Suddenly, the walls of the room began to pulsate, the stone vibrating as if the house itself were alive and angry. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling Carter's head with a jumbled mess of voices and threats. He could barely think over the noise. The woman figure lunged again, and Carter, driven by sheer adrenaline, grabbed the knife from his belt. He slashed at her, the silver edge cutting through her spectral form. She screeched, a sound that was both human and inhuman, and staggered back, dissolving into dark mist. "Carter, the door!" Sloane cried out, her voice breaking through the chaos. The skeletal man had stopped attacking, his gaze fixed on something behind them. Carter turned to see what Sloane was looking at. The door was shifting, warping, as if something was trying to break through from the other side. He grabbed Sloane's hand, yanking her toward the shifting door. "We need to get out now." As they reached the door, the skeletal man let out a final, chilling scream before disappearing into thin air. The door flung open just as Carter and Sloane reached it, revealing another dark corridor. They ran down the corridor, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The whispers followed them, growing louder and more frantic. It was as though the house was alive and was determined to drag them back. Suddenly, Carter stumbled, nearly falling as he tripped over something hidden in the dark. He shined his flashlight down and saw a body, one of the missing rescue team members. The man was mutilated beyond recognition, his eyes wide open in a frozen screen. "God," Sloane whispered, her face paling as she turned away from the gruesome sight. Carter swallowed hard, pulling Sloane along. "We need to find another way out. The house isn't going to let us leave easily." They continued running, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The corridor twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the darkness. The whispers were now a deafening roar, and the temperature dropped rapidly. They could see their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Ahead, a light flickered, faint and barely perceptible. Carter and Sloane hurried toward it, hoping for an exit. But as they neared the light, it began to dim, the darkness closing in around them. "Keep moving," Carter urged, as the light faded completely, plunging them into complete darkness once more. The light was gone, swallowed by the impenetrable darkness of the corridor. Carter and Sloane stumbled forward, their footsteps muffled by the thick, oppressive silence. The whispers had turned into a cacophony of disembodied voices, echoing off the walls and making it hard to think straight. Suddenly, a cold wind blew through the corridor, extinguishing the faint remnants of their flashlights. The darkness was absolute, an all-encompassing blackness that seemed to press in from all sides. Carter's heart raced as he fumbled for his remaining gear, trying to get some sense of direction. "Carter, where are we going?" Sloane's voice was barely more than a whisper, trembling with fear. "I don't know," Carter admitted, his own voice tight with anxiety. "But we can't stay here." Just then, a low, guttural growl filled the corridor. It was deep and resonant, vibrating through Carter's bones. The temperature plummeted, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. In the pitch blackness, Carter's flashlight flickered back to life, revealing a massive, shadowy figure at the end of the corridor. The figure was tall and thin, its shape shifting and warping as if it were made of smoke and shadows. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent red light, and its presence seemed to consume the light around it. Sloane gasped, grabbing Carter's arm. "What is that?" "That," Carter said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is the Shadowman." The Shadowman stepped forward, its form growing more solid with each step. Its face was a shifting mask of darkness, eyes glowing with a fierce, unnatural light. The whispers seemed to emanate from it, a chorus of tortured souls merging into a single, horrifying entity. Carter's breath caught in his throat. The Shadowman was known for its ability to manipulate darkness, to twist reality to its will. It could drive people mad with fear and despair. "Run!" Carter shouted, grabbing Sloane and pulling her down the corridor. The Shadowman's growls grew louder, its steps echoing ominously behind them. As they ran, the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, the darkness closing in around them. The whispers were now a maddening roar, filling their minds with fear and dread. Carter's flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance and mock them. Behind them, the Shadowman pursued with relentless speed, its presence growing more oppressive. The temperature dropped further, frost forming on the walls and ground. Carter and Sloane's breaths came out in visible puffs of cold air. They turned a corner and skidded to a halt. The corridor ahead was blocked by a massive stone wall, its surface covered in strange, glowing runes. The Shadowman's growls were almost upon them, its red eyes burning with unholy fury. "We're trapped!" Sloane screamed, her voice breaking. Carter glanced at the runes on the wall, trying to make sense of them. They seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light, a glimmer of hope in the encroaching darkness. "Hold on!" Carter shouted, grabbing Sloane's hand and pushing her toward the wall. "We need to find a way through." As the Shadowman's growls grew louder and more menacing, Carter's mind raced. The runes on the wall seemed to form a pattern, a sort of code. If they could figure it out, they might be able to open the way. With the Shadowman closing in, Carter's desperation reached its peak. He reached out to touch the runes, his fingers trembling, and felt a sudden surge of energy. The wall began to glow brighter, the runes shifting and changing. The Shadowman let out a final, enraged roar, but the wall began to crack open, revealing a narrow passage beyond. Carter and Sloane dove through the opening, just as the Shadowman's claws slashed at the wall, narrowly missing them. They tumbled into the passage, gasping for breath as the wall sealed behind them. The darkness was still there, but they had escaped the Shadowman for now. The passage was narrow and winding, the walls closing in with each step. The air was stifling, thick with an oppressive energy that seemed to press down on Carter and Sloane. Their breaths came in ragged gasps as they made their way through the labyrinthine tunnel, the darkness swallowing them whole. Sloane stumbled, her flashlight flickering weakly. "Carter, I don't know how much longer I can go." Carter glanced at her, his face etched with worry. The pain in his arm was growing worse, the dark veins spreading up toward his shoulder. "We have to keep moving. There's no turning back now." Ahead, the tunnel opened into a large, cavernous chamber. The floor was uneven, covered in jagged rocks and deep cracks. The walls were adorned with grotesque carvings, twisted faces and horrific scenes etched into the stone. The air was filled with a low, droning hum that seemed to come from all directions. Carter and Sloane stepped into the chamber, their footsteps echoing off the walls. The hum grew louder, vibrating through their bones. It felt as though the chamber itself was alive, pulsing with an ancient, malevolent energy. In the center of the chamber stood a large, ornate altar, its surface covered in strange symbols and dark stains. Surrounding the altar were dozens of candles, their flames flickering weakly in the stale air. Carter approached the altar cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the symbols etched into the surface. They seemed to shift and writhe, forming patterns that were both mesmerizing and horrifying. The droning hum grew louder, as if the altar itself was resonating with the sound. "This place," Sloane said, her voice trembling. "It feels like it's calling to us." Carter nodded, his eyes scanning the chamber. "We need to find a way out, but we also need to understand what's happening here. This altar, it might be the key." Suddenly, the chamber shook violently, the walls cracking as if they were being torn apart. The droning hum turned into a deafening roar, and the candle's flames flared wildly, casting eerie shadows across the chamber. From the shadows emerged a figure, tall and thin, with eyes glowing a sickly green. It was one of the Bexley family members, their face twisted in a grotesque smile. The figure moved with unnatural speed, its limbs elongating and contorting as it approached them. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure hissed, its voice a raspy whisper. "The house, it demands more." Before Carter or Sloane could react, the chamber was filled with an intense, blinding light. The symbols on the altar began to glow with an unearthly radiance, and the ground beneath them trembled. The Bexley figure was consumed by the light, its screams merging with the roaring hum. The chamber was collapsing, the walls crumbling as the light intensified. Carter and Sloane had no choice but to run, their only option to escape the collapsing chamber. Carter and Sloane raced through the collapsing tunnel, their footsteps echoing off the walls as the ground shook violently beneath them. The light from the chamber had dimmed to an ominous glow, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out for them. "Carter, we have to find a way out," Sloane shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the collapsing tunnel. Carter glanced back, his heart pounding as he saw the tunnel walls cracking and crumbling. "This way," he yelled, pulling Sloane down a narrow side passage that seemed to lead upward. They climbed desperately, their hands slipping on the damp, uneven walls. The temperature was dropping rapidly, the cold seeping into their bones. Carter's wound was burning with a searing pain, the dark veins spreading further up his arm. As they reached the top of the passage, they found themselves in a small, circular room. The walls were lined with ancient runes, and in the center stood a large iron door. The door was covered in intricate symbols, and a faint, eerie light seemed to emanate from it. "We need to get through this door," Carter said, his voice tight with exhaustion. It's our only way out. Sloane nodded, her eyes scanning the symbols on the door. There has to be a way to open it. Look for something, anything. Carter's flashlight flickered weakly as he examined the symbols. They seemed to form a pattern, a code that was both familiar and alien. He ran his fingers over the symbols, trying to decipher their meaning. Suddenly, a cold, ghostly laugh echoed through the room, and the door began to shake violently. The runes on the door glowed with an eerie light, and the temperature dropped even further. From the shadows emerged a monstrous figure, a twisted amalgamation of the Shadowman, crawlers, and skinwalkers. Its eyes burned with a malevolent fire, and its presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. "You can't escape," the figure rasped, its voice a chilling blend of all the horrors they had encountered. "The house will keep you forever." Carter and Sloane backed away, their faces pale with terror. The figure lunged at them, its claws slashing through the air. Carter raised his flashlight, but it was barely more than a flicker in the face of the creature's darkness. Sloane grabbed Carter's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Carter, what do we do?" Carter's mind raced as he glanced at the symbols on the door. He noticed a small, hidden latch embedded in the iron surface. With shaking hands, he reached for it, pulling it open. The door creaked and groaned as it slowly began to open. The monstrous figure howled in fury as the door opened wider, its presence fading as the light from the room grew stronger. Carter and Sloane stumbled through the door, emerging into the fresh air of the outside world. They fell to the ground, gasping for breath as the sun rose over the horizon. The house loomed behind them, dark and menacing, but for now they were free. Carter looked at Sloane, his face pale but determined. "It's over," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We survived." But even as they left the Riddle House behind, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something still lurked in the darkness, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to cross its path.